We have been looking at resources that deplete attention, self-control, decision quality. Today we look at the physiological system that underlies all of them, the stress response, and what cortisol actually does to the thinking brain. Think about the last time you were under real pressure. A deadline closing in, a difficult conversation you had to have, a moment where everything felt urgent at once. Did you notice that your thinking sometimes sharpened? You found words faster. You moved through the problem with unusual clarity. And then think about a different kind of stress, the kind that does not end, the project that drags on for months, the relationship tension that never resolves, the background hum of worry that is just always there. That kind of stress does not sharpen you. It erodes you. You forget things mid-sentence. Your flexibility disappears. You react rather than think. Here is what the science tells us. Those two experiences are not just different in degree. They involve meaningfully different biological states. And once you understand which state you are in and what it is doing to your brain, you get a real tool for managing it. That is what this episode is about. This is MindScope, where we turn the science of everyday behavior into tools you can actually use. Today, the tool is for stress, specifically for telling the difference between the kind that helps you perform and the kind that quietly dismantles your thinking. By the end of this episode, you will understand what cortisol is and what it actually does in the brain, why acute stress can sharpen cognitive performance while chronic stress degrades it, how to read the physiological signal that tells you which state you are in, and 2 moves you can make when the needle tips the wrong way. This is not about eliminating stress. It is about understanding it well enough to work with it. Let us start with the biology, kept short and precise. When your brain detects a threat or a demand, it sets off a cascade along what researchers call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, often shortened to the HPA axis. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland, which signals the adrenal glands, which release cortisol into the bloodstream. Cortisol is the primary stress hormone. It is also one of the most important regulatory hormones in the body. It touches virtually every organ system. In an acute situation, that burst of cortisol does a set of useful things. It mobilizes glucose so your brain and muscles have fuel. It sharpens attention toward the relevant threat. It amplifies memory encoding for the experience, which makes evolutionary sense because you want to remember what was dangerous. And at moderate levels, it supports what is called working memory, your capacity to hold information in mind and manipulate it, the cognitive resource that underlies almost everything you do on a complex task. The researcher Sonia Lupien and her colleagues, in work published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, describe this as an inverted U relationship between stress and cognitive performance. Some cortisol helps. More than some starts to hurt. The curve goes up, peaks, then comes back down. What sits at the peak is moderate, time-limited stress, the kind that is proportionate to a real demand, and that ends when the demand resolves. To understand why chronic stress is so damaging to thinking, you need to know a little about the part of the brain it hits hardest. The prefrontal cortex sits at the front of your brain, behind your forehead. It is responsible for working memory, cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control, the ability to hold a plan in mind, shift between approaches when one is not working, and stop yourself from acting on impulse. These are what scientists call executive functions, and they are the capacities that make sustained, complex, adaptive thinking possible. The prefrontal cortex is exquisitely sensitive to cortisol. In a landmark series of studies, Amy Arnson at Yale showed that high levels of stress-related chemicals, including cortisol, impair prefrontal cortex function in measurable, specific ways. Under sustained elevated stress, the neurons in the prefrontal cortex lose some of the physical structures that carry signals between them. The connectivity degrades. The region becomes less effective at its core jobs. What does that feel like from the inside? Working memory drops, so you cannot hold as many pieces of information in mind at once. Cognitive flexibility narrows, so when one approach is not working, you keep trying it anyway rather than pivoting. Inhibitory control weakens, so you react impulsively to small triggers that you would normally absorb without noticing. And here is the consequence that connects directly to everything we have been discussing this season. The same resources that deplete when you are tired, decision fatigued, or attention drained are precisely the resources that cortisol degrades when it is chronically elevated. So if acute stress sharpens you and chronic stress degrades you, The obvious question is, how do you know which state you are in? The answer is not as simple as asking yourself how stressed you feel. Chronic stress is especially tricky because you can adapt to it, normalize it, and stop registering it as stress at all, while it continues to affect your cognition. There is a clearer signal. Hold that question, because it is the pivot point of the practical half of this episode. The research draws a clear distinction between acute and chronic stress, and the dividing line is essentially recovery. Acute stress is a response to a discrete demand. The demand arrives, cortisol rises, you mobilize, the demand resolves, cortisol returns to baseline. The system was designed for exactly this cycle. What it was not designed for is extended periods of activation without recovery. When the stress response stays activated, or when it is triggered so frequently that baseline cortisol remains elevated, the effects on the brain begin to shift from adaptive to degenerative. Researchers Bruce McEwen and John Wingfield introduced the concept of allostatic load to describe this accumulated cost. Allostatic load is the wear and the tear on the body and brain that results from prolonged or repeated stress activation. When allostatic load accumulates beyond a threshold, what was protective becomes damaging. McEwen's work showed that chronic stress produces measurable structural changes in the brain, including remodeling of neurons in the hippocampus, the region critical for memory consolidation, and in the prefrontal cortex. Importantly, some of these changes are reversible when the stress is removed and recovery is allowed. That is a meaningful finding. It means the system has plasticity in both directions. The practical implication is this: the transition from acute to chronic is not a cliff. It is a gradual accumulation. The signal you want to watch is not the intensity of any single stressful event. It is whether your nervous system is returning to a calm baseline between demands. So how do you read that signal reliably? Chronic stress has some behavioral and cognitive signatures that are more consistent than the subjective feeling of being stressed. Pay attention to these three. First, disproportionate reactivity. When you find yourself genuinely irritated by things that would normally be minor, when small friction triggers a response that you recognize, afterward, as out of proportion, that gap between the trigger and the reaction is often a cortisol signal. The inhibitory control that would normally dampen that reaction is impaired. Second, cognitive stickiness. If you notice you are solving the same problem the same way repeatedly when it keeps not working, without naturally shifting to a new approach, that narrowing of cognitive flexibility is a marker. It is not stubbornness. It is a prefrontal cortex that is not functioning at full capacity because the system has been under load. Third, recovery quality. Ask yourself honestly, when you have a genuine break from demands, a weekend, an evening, a quiet hour, do you feel restored, or does the tension not actually lift? If breaks do not actually restore your baseline, the system is not completing its recovery cycle. None of these are diagnostic. They are signals to take seriously. If these patterns are persistent and affecting your daily functioning, reaching out to a qualified mental health professional is the right move, not a last resort. The evidence points to two categories of intervention that work with the biology rather than against it. Not strategies that suppress the stress response, but strategies that support the recovery cycle that the system is designed to complete. The first is controlled breathing, specifically the kind that extends the exhale. Research published in Cell Reports Medicine tested several breathing practices in a randomized daily protocol and found that cyclic sighing produced the largest reductions in physiological arousal and the greatest mood improvements. Cyclic sighing involves a double inhale through the nose, a short first breath, and then a second short sniff at the top to fully expand the lungs, followed by a long, slow exhale through the mouth until the lungs are empty. Physiologically, the extended exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the branch that counteracts the stress response. You do not need a long practice. 5 minutes produced measurable results in the study. The second is what exercise physiologists and sleep researchers converge on from different directions: physical movement and protected sleep. Moderate aerobic exercise has been shown to reduce cortisol levels in the hours that follow and to improve prefrontal cortex function in the short term. Sleep is when the brain clears metabolic byproducts and consolidates memory, and sleep deprivation itself elevates cortisol while impairing the same prefrontal functions that chronic stress degrades. The compounding effect cuts in both directions. Good sleep and movement support recovery. Poor sleep and inactivity extend the activation. Neither of these is a cure for a genuinely stressful life situation. They are biological support tools that help the stress response system complete its cycle rather than staying open. Here is the full framework in one breath. Your brain runs a stress system that is adaptive in the short term and degenerative in the long term. Moderate, time-limited cortisol sharpens your thinking, specifically working memory, attention, and memory encoding. Chronically elevated cortisol impairs exactly those functions by degrading prefrontal cortex performance. The signal to watch is not how intense any single stressor feels. It is whether your nervous system is actually recovering between demands. You can read that signal through disproportionate reactivity, cognitive stickiness, and the quality of your rest. The two moves that work with the biology are extended exhale breathing to activate the recovery branch of the nervous system, and protecting the two biological cycles, movement and sleep, that clear the accumulated load. You are not trying to eliminate cortisol. You are trying to keep the system cycling the way it was designed to, activated by demands, and then restored to baseline. If this gave you a more precise way to think about stress rather than just a pile of advice to manage it, consider subscribing, because the next episode goes into something closely related. We have spent this season mapping what depletes your cognitive resources. The next episode turns that map into a question. What actually restores them? And why does your brain treat genuine recovery so differently from simply stopping work? Before you go, one question for the comments. When you think about your own stress, does it tend to feel time-limited and releasing, or does it feel like something that does not fully lift? I would genuinely like to know. See you in the next one.